A few people to apologise to, though, haven't you?
The United States of America will be in the front of the queue.
The face of Brexit, Boris Johnson, is appointed UK Foreign Secretary as the new Prime Minister Theresa May embarks on a government shake-up. US Secretary of State John Kerry is due in Moscow on Thursday to discuss plans to team up American and Russian forces in their operations against terror groups in Syria. Also ahead this RT News Hour, the survivors of last November's Paris massacre are suing the French government over intelligence lapses, which they claim ultimately failed to prevent acts of terror. Around the clock across the world, this is RT International. My name's Ewan O'Neill. Welcome to the programme. Our top story, Brexit figurehead and flamboyant former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, has been appointed the UK's Foreign Secretary. It's one of new Prime Minister Theresa May's most surprising appointments as she assembles her government. And Johnson's first comments as the country's top diplomat suggest he has a couple of things to resolve before embarking on his new role.
You've got a few people to apologise to, though, haven't you? President Obama, for example.
Well, as I say, the United States of America will be in the front of the queue. Thank you.
Boris Johnson there was referring to his comment about Barack Obama back in April when he called him a part Kenyan president who held an ancestral dislike of the British Empire. But it's Johnson's firm stance on Brexit, which could mean UK-US relations are left somewhat strained.
The United Kingdom is at its best when it's helping to lead a strong Europe. Our focus is in negotiating with a big bloc, the European Union, to get a trade agreement done. And UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
The prominent Leave campaigner Boris back then was quite outspoken in his criticism of Obama's intervention.
I just think it paradoxical that the United States, which wouldn't dream of allowing the slightest infringement of its own sovereignty, should be lecturing other countries about the need to enmesh themselves ever deeper in a federal superstate.
The UK now has arguably the most Eurosceptic Conservative MP in charge of the nation's foreign relations. Let's recap some of Boris's harshest words of criticism over the crisis-ridden EU bloc.
The euro is a calamitous project. There's too much legislation coming from the EU. The European Union is now causing such stresses and strains. They say we have no choice but to bow down to Brussels. We say they are woefully underestimating this country and what it can do. We will continue to be like passengers locked in the back of a minicab with a wonky sat-nav, driven by a driver who doesn't have perfect command of English and going in a direction we frankly don't want to go.
Well, Boris isn't to be exactly in charge of Brexit. There is a separate Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, but Boris will be at the table.
Harry fear with the report, while Britain's role in the EU is not the only topic where Boris Johnson's rhetoric has gone against the mainstream.
You want an example of EU foreign policy making on the hoof and the EU's pretensions to running a defence policy that have caused real trouble, then look at what has happened in Ukraine.
Well, the conflict in Ukraine was where EU-Russia relations took a sharp turn for the worse, sparking fears there could be another Cold War. Here again is Johnson's stance going against the flow. He said it's time to set aside the Cold War mindset and that not everything good for Putin is automatically bad for the West. His comments on Syria also sparked controversy. He said he backs the efforts of Assad and Russia in their fight against ISIL. Journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark says Johnson's appointment as Foreign Secretary could signal a dramatic shift in Britain's relations with its allies.
Boris Johnson does represent a shift in foreign policy. In what he's said so far and what he's written so far, he's not a neoconservative. He's actually criticised the US, he's actually criticised the EU for kicking things off in Ukraine a few years ago. He's actually praised the Syrian government when they retook Palmyra. He wrote an article in the Telegraph saying, bravo, Assad. And he's not a hawk, particularly when it comes to Russia. The problem could come with Hillary Clinton being elected, if she were to be elected, Hillary the Hawk. And we know that Boris Johnson has said some pretty uncomplimentary things about Hillary Clinton in the past, so a lot will depend what happens in November in America.
Moving on now, the US-backed Syrian rebel group Jaish al-Islam has shelled residential areas in Damascus province, the group's 10th violation in just 2 weeks. RT's Gaine Chichikan looks at the issue facing the US and Russia in defining rebel groups there.
As the U.S. and Russia are trying to make the cessation of hostilities in Syria work, it is still not clear what they're going to do with groups that Russia considers terrorists and the U.S. doesn't, particularly Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam. They're accused of numerous atrocities. Recently, Secretary Kerry came somewhat close to Russia's understanding of what's going on when he said this.
Daesh and al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is the other group there. Jabhat al-Nusra are designated terrorist group by the United Nations. And there are a couple of subgroups underneath the two designated, Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, Jaish al-Islam, Ahrar al-Sham particularly, who brush off and fight with that alongside these other two sometimes to fight the Assad regime.
So even though Secretary Kerry called Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam subgroups of designated terrorists, the U.S. has still resisted treating them as terrorists. I asked the State Department.
Doesn't the Secretary's assessment that these groups are subgroups of designated terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda in Syria, which is al-Nusra, doesn't that warrant some change of policy? Or do you think that as long as these terrorist subgroups call themselves differently, they're off the hook?
I think, you know, I've spoken to this before. I'll say much the same as I've said before, which is that we recognize that, you know, in places like Aleppo and elsewhere, that there's a mixing or commingling, whatever you want to call it, and that we need to work more closely together to disentangle, you know, where these groups are mixing with known terrorist groups.
If you insist that these groups be treated differently, then you also suggest that there is a distinction between them and al-Nusra. What is that distinction?
Well, again, you know, these groups have been designated, as I was trying to make the point to Matt, through a very detailed process.
So according to the U.S., the reason they are not treated as terrorists is because they have not been designated as terrorists by the UN. In May, the U.S. blocked an initiative at the UN Security Council to designate these groups as terrorist organizations, along with al-Nusra and Daesh.
You stand up and say, well, the reason they're not on the list is because it hasn't gone through that process. And I'm just saying, don't you think it's a bit disingenuous to say they're not on the list because it hasn't gone through this process, when you are one of the prime reasons that they haven't been gone through, that it hasn't gone through this process?
Well, again, I'm not going to speak to that.
For months, U.S. officials have been saying that they work to disentangle these rebel groups, particularly from al-Nusra, yet no progress has been reported.
Well, we got the thoughts of Gregory Copley, editor of Defense and Foreign Affairs Publications. He told us the U.S. is now recognizing that the use of proxy forces in Syria has backfired.
Both Ahrar al-Islam and Jaish al-Islam are basically groups which engage in horrific insurgency warfare. They are proxy forces for the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey. So they have to basically gently disavow them and move away from them, but to now label them as terrorist groups directly would be a reflection on U.S. policy to this point. The U.S. knows that it's a no-win situation in Syria. It also knows that Turkey is in the midst of a severe civil war. Both Turkey and Saudi Arabia have recognized that the jihadist groups they've set as proxy forces in Syria and Iraq have now moved out of their control, so maybe they're very happy to call it quits in Syria.